The crack of a gunshot pierced the Montana twilight, echoing down Clearwater's dusty main street as Florence Reed stumbled behind Hargrove's general store. Her once pristine blue calico dress was torn at the shoulder, blood seeping through where the bullet had grazed her. It was 1876, and she had made a terrible mistake coming west on her own, chasing promises that turned to ash in her mouth. Florence pressed herself against the rough wooden wall, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she listened for footsteps. Her body trembled uncontrollably, partly from the cold spring evening, but mostly from fear. The man who had shot at her so-called protector in this frontier town, would surely find her soon. Should have stayed in Boston, she whispered to herself, wincing as she touched her wounded shoulder. Should have listened to father. The crunch of boots on gravel made her freeze. Florence curled into herself, making her body as small as possible behind a stack of empty crates. She closed her eyes, praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. The footsteps stopped. Florence could feel someone's presence, the weight of their gaze. She slowly opened her eyes and looked up. A tall figure stood silhouetted against the darkening sky. His broad shoulders were draped in a worn duster, and the brim of his hat cast shadows across his face. A cowboy. Not her pursuer, but still a stranger. In Florence's brief experience in Clearwater, strangers weren't to be trusted. He said nothing at first, just stood there, studying her with eyes she couldn't quite see in the gathering darkness. His hand rested casually on his holstered pistol, but he made no move to draw it. Florence tried to push herself further into the wall, as if she could disappear through it. The movement sent pain shooting through her shoulder, and she couldn't suppress a whimper. The cowboy slowly crouched down, keeping a respectful distance. Still silent, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief. He offered it to her, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I won't hurt you, madam," he finally said, his voice low and gravelly, as if unused to speaking. "But you're bleeding." Florence stared at the outstretched hand, then at what little she could see of his face. Something in his voice, perhaps the lack of demands or expectations, made her reach out with trembling fingers to take the handkerchief. "Thank you," she whispered, pressing it against her wound. He nodded once, then cocked his head, listening. Florence heard it too, angry voices from the street, men calling her name. "Florence Reed, show yourself, you ungrateful—" The cowboy's expression hardened at the crude language that followed. He looked back at Florence. "That man hunting you?" She nodded, fresh tears forming. "He said he'd protect me. Brought me here from the stagecoach station, but then he—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The cowboy stood, his movement fluid despite his size. "Stay here." It wasn't a request. He stepped away, disappearing around the corner of the building. Florence pressed the handkerchief harder against her wound, straining to hear what was happening. There were voices, the cowboy's deep rumble and the angry snarl of Vernon Price, the man who had promised her work and safety only to try to force himself on her when they reached his cabin. The voices grew louder, more heated. Then silence. Florence held her breath. Had Price shot the cowboy? Was he coming for her now? The crunch of boots returned. Florence prepared herself to run, though she had nowhere to go. But it was the cowboy who reappeared, his expression unreadable in the near darkness. "He won't be bothering you anymore," he said simply. "Did you?" Florence couldn't bring herself to say the word, kill. The cowboy shook his head. "Just convinced him you're not worth the trouble." He paused. "You got somewhere to go?" Florence shook her head, despair washing over her. "I just arrived today. I don't know anyone. I was supposed to work for him." She gestured vaguely toward the street. The cowboy was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed, a sound of resignation rather than annoyance. "I've got a place outside town. Simple cabin. You can stay in the barn tonight. It's clean. Got fresh hay? Tomorrow we'll figure something else out. Florence hesitated. Going with another strange man seemed like jumping from the cooking pot into the fire. But her options were limited, and something about this quiet cowboy felt different. "Why would you help me?" she asked. For the first time, he removed his hat, revealing a face younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with sharp features, softened only by eyes that seemed to hold their own share of painful memories. "My sister," he said simply, "came west with the wrong man. Nobody helped her." He replaced his hat. "Name's Jackson Blackwood. Most folks call me Jack." "Florence Reed," she replied, trying to stand. Her legs, weak from fear and exhaustion, buckled beneath her. Without a word, Jack stepped forward and steadied her with a hand on her uninjured arm. His touch was careful, impersonal. "Can you ride?" he asked. Florence nodded, though in truth she'd only ridden placid carriage horses in Boston parks. But the alternative was sleeping in this alley, or finding herself at the mercy of other men like Vernon Price. "My horse is tied at the saloon," Jack said. "Wait here." He returned minutes later leading a magnificent buckskin gelding. The horse regarded Florence with intelligent eyes, seemingly assessing her as Jack had done. "This is Copper," Jack said, with the first hint of warmth in his voice. "Best horse in Montana Territory." He helped Florence mount, then swung up behind her with practiced ease. She stiffened at the proximity, but Jack maintained a respectful distance, his arms reaching around her only to hold the reins. "It's about 4 miles," he said. "Try to rest if you can." As they rode out of town, Florence felt the curious stares of the few people still on the streets. What must they think, seeing her riding with this mysterious cowboy? But she was too exhausted to care. The night air grew colder as they left Clearwater behind. Jack urged Copper into a smooth canter, and the rhythmic movement of the horse combined with Florence's exhaustion made her eyelids heavy. Despite her best efforts, she found herself leaning back against Jack's solid chest. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "Rest," was his only reply. Florence drifted into a fitful doze, waking only when the horse's gait changed as they turned onto a narrower trail. Ahead, she could make out the dark shape of a cabin against the star-filled sky. A dog barked, then another. "That's Scout and Ranger," Jack said. "They're noisy, but gentle." True to his word, when they reached the small homestead, 2 large dogs bounded up, tails wagging furiously. Jack dismounted first, then helped Florence down. Her legs nearly gave way again, but his strong hands kept her upright. The barn was indeed clean, with a fresh pile of hay in one corner. Jack lit a lantern, illuminating the simple structure. There were 2 horse stalls, one now empty for Copper, a tack room, and a small workshop area. "Wait here," Jack said, disappearing back outside. He returned minutes later with a canteen, a bundle of cloth, and what looked like a jar of salve. "Need to tend that wound," he said. "Can't risk infection out here." Florence hesitated, then nodded. She tried to slip her dress off her injured shoulder, but the movement sent fresh pain through her arm. Jack cleared his throat. "I can help, if you're comfortable, or I can fetch what you need and leave you be." Florence considered. She was in the middle of nowhere with a man she'd just met, and yet, he'd had every opportunity to harm her already if that had been his intention. "I need help," she admitted, "but I've never—" "I'll be respectful," Jack promised, understanding her concern. "Just going to clean the wound and bandage it, nothing more." With gentle hands that belied his rough appearance, Jack helped Florence ease the dress off her shoulder, keeping his eyes focused solely on the injury. The bullet had indeed only grazed her, but it had left an angry furrow about 3 inches long. "You're lucky," Jack said, carefully cleaning the wound with water from the canteen. "Few inches to the right, and we wouldn't be having this conversation." Florence winced as he applied the salve, which stung fiercely before producing a cooling sensation. "What is that?" she asked. "Old Cheyenne remedy," Jack replied. "Learned it from a medicine woman years back. Works better than anything the doctor in town has." He bandaged her shoulder with practiced efficiency, then helped her adjust her dress. Throughout the entire process, his touch remained clinical, his expression neutral. "Thank you," Florence said, feeling oddly vulnerable now that the immediate crisis had passed. Jack nodded. "There's a blanket there," he said, pointing to a shelf. "Nights get cold. I'll bring you some food from the cabin." He returned with a plate of beans, bacon, and biscuits, along with a cup of coffee. "It's not much," he apologized. "It's more than I expected," Florence replied honestly. She hadn't eaten since early morning, and despite everything, her hunger was sharp. Jack hovered awkwardly for a moment. "Cabin's locked, but I'll be on the porch if you need anything. Dogs will be out here too." Florence nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the day. "Mr. Blackwood, Jack, thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or memory. "Get some rest, Miss Reed. Tomorrow's soon enough to figure things out." After he left, Florence ate quickly, then made a nest in the hay, wrapping the surprisingly soft blanket around herself. Outside, she could hear the soft nickering of Copper, the occasional whine of the dogs, and faintly, the creak of the porch as Jack settled in for the night. For the first time since arriving in Montana, Florence felt safe. As she drifted off to sleep, she wondered about the quiet cowboy and the sister he'd mentioned. What had happened to her? And why had Jack chosen to help a stranger when so many others had looked away? Morning came with the crowing of a rooster and the warm breath of Copper investigating the new visitor in his domain. Florence woke disoriented, her body stiff from sleeping on the ground and her shoulder throbbing. For a moment, panic gripped her as she tried to remember where she was. Then it all came flooding back: Vernon Price's unwanted advances, her desperate flight, the gunshot, and the silent cowboy who had come to her rescue. She sat up, wincing at the pain in her shoulder. The barn door was open, letting in the golden light of early morning. Outside, she could hear movement: the clucking of chickens, the distant lowing of cattle, and the sound of an axe striking wood. Florence used a little water from the canteen Jack had left to wash her face and smooth her hair as best she could. Her dress was torn and stained with blood, but there was nothing to be done about that now. When she stepped outside, the cool morning air made her shiver slightly. The homestead was modest but well kept: a small log cabin with a covered porch, a corral beside the barn, a chicken coop, and beyond, a fenced pasture where several cattle grazed. The surrounding landscape took her breath away. Rolling hills covered in spring grass stretched toward distant mountains still capped with snow. Jack was at a chopping block beside the cabin, splitting firewood. He'd removed his duster and rolled up his sleeves, revealing muscular forearms tanned by the sun. He paused when he saw her, setting down the axe. "Morning," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "How's the shoulder?" "Painful," Florence admitted. "But I think your medicine helped." Jack nodded. "Coffee's on in the cabin. Biscuits too, if you're hungry." Florence hesitated at the threshold of the cabin, suddenly aware of the impropriety of entering a bachelor's home. Jack seemed to read her thoughts. "It's not much," he said, "but it's decent enough. Door stays open if you prefer." The interior of the cabin was surprisingly neat. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking area beside it. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat in the center of the room. Against the far wall was a narrow bed, neatly made with a colorful quilt. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with more volumes than Florence would have expected. Jack poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her, then pulled out a chair at the table. Florence sat, cradling the warm cup in her hands. You like to read? She observed, nodding toward the books. Something like embarrassment crossed Jack's face. Winter nights are long out here. Florence smiled for the first time since arriving in Clearwater. I love books. I worked in my father's bookshop in Boston. Jack's eyebrows rose slightly. Boston's a long way from Montana territory. Florence's smile faded. Yes, it is. Jack didn't press, just placed a plate of biscuits on the table and sat across from her. Need to check that wound after breakfast. Then we should talk about what comes next. What comes next? Florence repeated softly. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. She was alone in a strange territory, with no money, no job, and no prospects. I don't know what comes next, Mr. Blackwood. Jack, he corrected. And you've got options. Clearwater's not the only town around. Silver Creek's about 20 miles west, bigger place. Might have work for a woman who knows books. Or there's the Harper place about 5 miles east. Mrs. Harper's expecting a baby soon. Might need help. Florence was touched by his consideration. You've thought about this? Jack shrugged. Had trouble sleeping? After breakfast, Jack redressed her wound with the same clinical detachment as the night before. The injury looked better in daylight, painful, but not dangerous. Should heal clean, Jack said, securing the fresh bandage. Might leave a scar, though. A reminder to be more careful about the company I keep, Florence said, attempting humor to mask her unease. Jack's expression darkened. Price has a reputation. Should have known better than to leave a newcomer to his care. He hesitated. What brought you to Clearwater alone, if you don't mind my asking? Not many Boston ladies make that journey without family. Florence sighed. The story was not one she was proud of, but this man had saved her life and deserved some explanation. I answered an advertisement, she admitted, for a teacher in Clearwater. The town council promised good wages and respectable lodging. When I arrived at the stage depot yesterday, Mr. Price said he was sent to escort me to my accommodations. She looked down at her hands. There never was a teaching position, was there? Jack's jaw tightened. Clearwater hasn't had a school in 3 years. Not enough children. Florence felt the sting of tears. I was so foolish. Father warned me about frontier swindlers, but I was so determined to make my own way. Why leave Boston? Jack asked, his voice gentler than she'd heard it before. Florence hesitated, then decided there was little point in hiding the truth. My father remarried last year. A lovely woman, truly, but with 5 children of her own. Our small home above the bookshop became very crowded, and I felt I was in the way. When I saw the advertisement, it seemed like Providence. Jack was silent for a long moment. No shame in wanting your own path, he finally said. Just picked the wrong trail this time. Florence managed a small smile. And you? What brought you to Montana? A shadow passed over Jack's face. War, he said simply. After Appomattox, couldn't go home to Virginia. Too many ghosts. He stood abruptly. Need to check the herd. You're welcome to rest here. As he headed for the door, Florence called after him. Your sister, the one you mentioned, what happened to her? Jack paused, his back to Florence. Died. Influenza, 4 years ago. Her husband had abandoned her by then. Without another word, he left, whistling for his dogs to follow. Florence spent the morning resting and exploring the cabin. The bookshelves revealed Jack's eclectic tastes: history, poetry, novels, and practical guides to ranching and farming. She was particularly surprised to find a well-worn copy of Pride and Prejudice among the volumes. Around noon, Jack returned, leading a different horse, a gentle-looking mare with a white blaze down her face. Thought we might ride to the Harper place, he said. See if Mrs. Harper needs help. This is Daisy. She's steady. Won't give you any trouble. Florence eyed the mare nervously. I should confess, I'm not much of a rider. A hint of amusement touched Jack's eyes. Figured as much, watching you on Copper yesterday. Daisy's different, like sitting in a rocking chair. With Jack's help, Florence changed into clothes he'd found, a simple shirt and trousers that must have belonged to his sister, though he didn't say so. They were a better option for riding than her torn dress. The ride to the Harper homestead was longer than Florence expected, but Jack had been right about Daisy. The mare moved with a smooth, easy gait that even Florence could manage comfortably. As they rode, Jack pointed out landmarks and shared bits of information about the area, which streams had the best fishing, which ridges to avoid during thunderstorms, where wild berries could be found in summer. His knowledge of the land was intimate, and Florence found herself relaxing in his company. How long have you been here? She asked. 8 years, Jack replied. Worked as a ranch hand first. Saved enough to buy my own place 3 years ago. It's small, but it's mine. You've built something to be proud of, Florence said sincerely. Jack glanced at her, surprised by the compliment. It's a living. The Harper homestead was larger than Jack's, a 2-story farmhouse with several outbuildings. As they approached, a man stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. When he recognized Jack, he lowered the weapon. Blackwood, he called. What brings you this way? Jack dismounted, then helped Florence from Daisy. Thomas Harper, this is Florence Reed, just arrived from Boston, looking for honest work. Thomas Harper was a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and kind eyes. He looked Florence over with frank curiosity. Boston, eh? Margaret will want to hear about that. She's from Philadelphia originally. He gestured toward the house. Come on in. She's resting, but she'll want company. Margaret Harper was indeed resting, her advanced pregnancy making movement difficult. But her eyes lit up at the sight of visitors, especially another Easterner. Oh, thank heavens, she exclaimed when Florence was introduced. Someone who knows what a proper tea service looks like. Thomas tries, bless him, but... Florence took to Margaret immediately. The older woman was warm and forthright, asking about Boston while sharing stories of her own journey west 5 years earlier. While the women talked, Jack and Thomas stepped outside to discuss cattle and the coming summer. Florence could see them through the window, Jack's tall figure relaxed as he conversed with his neighbor. He's a good man, Jack Blackwood, Margaret said, following Florence's gaze. Keeps to himself mostly, but always there when needed. Florence turned back to her hostess. He rescued me yesterday. I was in trouble in Clearwater. Margaret's expression darkened. Vernon Price? When Florence nodded, Margaret sighed. That man has caused nothing but grief. You're fortunate Jack found you. Yes, Florence agreed softly. I am. As their visit continued, it became clear that Margaret indeed needed help. With 3 young children and another on the way, the homestead was more than she could manage alone. We've been trying to find someone reliable, Thomas explained when he and Jack rejoined the women. Last girl was homesick after a week and left with a cattle drive heading east. I'm not afraid of hard work, Florence assured them. And I'm good with children. Margaret and Thomas exchanged a glance. We can offer room and board plus $10 a month, Thomas said. It's not much. It's perfect, Florence interrupted. When would you like me to start? Why not today? Margaret suggested. We have a small room upstairs. It's yours for as long as you want it. Florence looked at Jack, suddenly uncertain. This kind, quiet man had rescued her, tended her wound, and now found her a safe place to stay. The thought of not seeing him again created an unexpected pang in her chest. Jack met her gaze, his expression unreadable. It's a good place, he said. Harpers are good people. Will you? Florence hesitated. Will you visit sometimes? To see how I'm faring? Something flickered in Jack's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or pleasure. I trade with Thomas regular. Be natural to stop by. And so it was decided. Florence would stay with the Harpers, helping with the children and household, while Margaret recovered from childbirth. Jack would return to his solitary cabin, continuing the life he'd built for himself in this wild country. As he prepared to leave, Florence walked with him to where the horses were tethered. The afternoon sun caught in his dark hair, revealing strands of copper she hadn't noticed before. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You've saved me in every way possible." Jack adjusted Copper's saddle, avoiding her eyes. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Florence said firmly. "They wouldn't. You know that better than anyone." Jack finally looked at her, and for a moment Florence glimpsed vulnerability beneath his stoic exterior. "Be careful, Miss Reed. Montana can be hard on gentle souls." "Florence," she corrected, "and perhaps gentle souls are exactly what Montana needs more of." A ghost of a smile touched Jack's lips. "Perhaps." He mounted Copper with easy grace. "I'll check on you in a week or so. Make sure you're settling in." As she watched him ride away, Florence felt a curious mixture of gratitude, uncertainty, and something else, a warm flutter in her chest when she thought of seeing him again. It was foolish, she knew. Jack Blackwood had simply done a good deed. Nothing more. Yet as she turned back toward the Harper house, Florence couldn't help but wonder if fate had more in store for her and the quiet cowboy who had said nothing at first. The first weeks at the Harper homestead passed in a blur of activity. Florence rose before dawn each day to help with breakfast, then tended to the children 8-year-old Benjamin, 6-year-old Emma, and 3-year-old James. In the afternoons, she assisted Margaret with household tasks, learning the rhythm of frontier life. It was exhausting work, but Florence found unexpected satisfaction in it. The children were bright and curious, especially when they discovered she knew stories they'd never heard. Each evening after chores, they would gather around her, eyes wide as she recounted tales from the books she'd read in her father's shop. Margaret's time came 3 weeks after Florence's arrival. The baby, a healthy girl they named Sarah, arrived after a difficult labor that left the household exhausted but joyful. Florence found herself responsible for much of the household management while Margaret recovered, a role she embraced with growing confidence. Through it all, she thought of Jack. He had visited twice once to trade with Thomas, bringing a haunch of venison and taking home some of Margaret's preserves, and again, to help repair the barn roof after a spring storm. Both visits had been brief, his manner cordial but reserved. Florence told herself not to be disappointed. Jack had done more than enough by rescuing her and finding her this position. That he continued to check on her was merely neighborly kindness, nothing more. Still, she found herself watching the road on days when Thomas mentioned Jack might stop by, and taking extra care with her appearance when he did. Margaret, observant despite her exhaustion, noticed. "Jack Blackwood is a complicated man," she said one evening as they prepared supper. "The war changed him," Thomas says. "He doesn't let many people close." Florence focused on kneading bread dough. "He's been very kind to me. I'm grateful." Margaret smiled knowingly. "Of course. Just gratitude." Florence felt her cheeks warm. "He's hardly shown any interest beyond common courtesy." "Jack doesn't show much of anything," Margaret replied, "but he's ridden over here twice in 3 weeks. Before you came, we might see him once in 2 months." Before Florence could respond, Benjamin burst into the kitchen, excitement written across his face. "Riders coming! It's Mr. Blackwood and some other men." Florence and Margaret exchanged glances before hurrying to the front porch. Sure enough, a group of riders was approaching Jack in the lead, with 3 men Florence didn't recognize following behind. Thomas emerged from the barn, rifle in hand, relaxing only when he identified the visitors. Jack dismounted first, his expression grave. "Thomas, Margaret." He greeted them, tipping his hat. His eyes lingered briefly on Florence, a flicker of something relief, crossing his face before he turned back to Thomas. Got trouble. Cattle rustlers hit the Peterson place last night. Took 20 head and shot Peterson when he tried to stop them. Thomas swore under his breath. Peterson dead? No, but it was close. Doc Simmons is with him now. Jack gestured to the men behind him. Sheriff's forming a posse. Thought you should know. Being this close to Peterson's land. As the men discussed the situation, Florence noticed that Jack kept glancing her way, as if reassuring himself she was still there. When Thomas went inside to fetch his rifle and ammunition, Jack approached the porch where Florence stood. "You're well?" he asked quietly. Florence nodded. "Very well. The Harpers have been kind." She hesitated. "But I worry about you riding after rustlers. It sounds dangerous." A hint of warmth touched Jack's eyes. "Been in worse spots." "That doesn't reassure me," Florence replied, surprising herself with her boldness. Jack's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I'll be careful." Thomas returned, ready to join the posse. After a hurried goodbye to Margaret and instructions for Florence to help guard the homestead, the men rode out, Jack glancing back once before they disappeared over the ridge. The next 3 days were tense. Thomas had taught Florence how to handle a shotgun. Just point and pull the trigger if anyone comes who isn't me, while Margaret kept a revolver close at hand. They took turns watching through the night, though no trouble came to the Harper place. On the 4th day, just as dusk was falling, they heard riders approaching. Margaret handed the baby to Florence and took up her position by the window with the revolver, while Florence herded the children into the back bedroom. "It's Thomas," Margaret called, relief evident in her voice. "And Jack's with him." Florence felt her heart leap. She quickly smoothed her hair before following the children, who were already racing outside to greet their father. Thomas looked exhausted but triumphant. "Got them," he announced. "Holed up in an abandoned mine near Silver Creek. Sheriff's taking them to Helena for trial." Jack dismounted more slowly, and Florence immediately noticed how he favored his left side. As he moved into the lantern light, she gasped. A dark blood stain spread across his shirt just below his ribs. "You're hurt," she said, moving toward him. Jack waved her concern away. "Just a graze." "Graze, hell," Thomas said. "One of them got him with a knife before Jack disarmed him. Needs looking after." Despite Jack's protests, Florence and Margaret insisted on tending to his wound. Thomas took the children to see to the horses, leaving Jack sitting uncomfortably at the kitchen table while Florence prepared hot water and clean cloths. "Remove your shirt, please," Florence said, trying to sound clinical rather than nervous. Jack hesitated, then complied, wincing as he pulled the bloodied fabric away from the wound. Florence had to force herself not to stare at his broad chest and shoulders, marked with old scars that spoke of past hardships. The knife wound was an ugly slash about 4 inches long just below his ribs on the left side. It wasn't dangerously deep, but it had bled considerably and needed cleaning. "This will hurt," Florence warned as she began to clean the wound. Jack's jaw tightened, but he made no sound as she worked. Margaret provided a needle and thread, then tactfully excused herself to check on the baby. "You've done this before," Jack observed as Florence prepared to stitch the wound. "I helped in a hospital during the war," Florence explained. "In Boston. Not on the front lines like you, but I learned a few things." Jack watched her face as she worked, her hands steady despite her awareness of his scrutiny. "You're different from what I expected," he said quietly. Florence glanced up, meeting his gaze. "Oh? And what did you expect from a Boston bookshop girl?" "Someone who'd have run back east by now," Jack admitted. "Life out here breaks many Easterners." "Perhaps I'm stronger than I look," Florence suggested, tying off the last stitch. Jack's eyes held hers. "Never doubted your strength. Not from the first moment I saw you." The air between them seemed to change, charged with unspoken possibilities. Florence became acutely aware of the heat of his skin beneath her fingers, the rhythm of his breathing, the way his dark hair curled slightly at his neck. The moment was broken by Thomas's return. Jack quickly pulled his shirt back on, thanking Florence with a nod that conveyed more than words could have. "You'll stay the night," Margaret insisted when Jack mentioned returning to his cabin. "That wound needs rest, and it's too dark to ride safely." Jack looked as if he might argue, but eventually nodded. "Obliged." Later, as Florence prepared a pallet for Jack near the fireplace, she found herself wondering about the man who had entered her life so unexpectedly. What dreams had brought him west? What sorrows had made him so solitary? And why did she feel such a powerful connection to someone she barely knew? She was still pondering these questions when sleep finally claimed her. Morning arrived with the usual cacophony of roosters, children, and livestock. Florence rose early to help with breakfast, finding Jack already awake and outside, splitting wood despite his injury. "You shouldn't be doing that," she scolded, hurrying across the yard. "You'll tear your stitches." Jack set down the axe, wiping sweat from his brow. "Needed the exercise," he said, though Florence noticed he was indeed moving carefully. "And Thomas has enough to do without chopping extra wood for a guest." "At least let me check the wound before you leave," Florence insisted, "to ensure it's not infected." Jack agreed with surprising readiness. In the kitchen, as Florence carefully examined the stitched cut, she found it clean and already beginning to heal. "You have a healthy constitution, Mr. Blackwood," she observed. "Jack," he reminded her, "and yes, I heal quick. Always have." As Florence rebandaged the wound, her fingers brushed against his skin. Jack inhaled sharply, and when Florence looked up, his eyes held an intensity that made her breath catch. "Florence," he began, his voice low. "Yes?" she whispered, suddenly very aware of how close they were standing. The kitchen door swung open as Benjamin burst in, oblivious to the moment he had interrupted. "Ma says breakfast is ready whenever you are, Miss Florence." The spell broken, Jack stepped back, clearing his throat. "Should get back to my place. Cattle need tending." Florence nodded, disappointed yet relieved. Whatever had been about to happen, she wasn't sure she was ready for it. After breakfast, Jack prepared to leave. As he saddled Copper, Florence approached with a small package. "Margaret insisted you take some fresh bread and preserves," she explained, "and I added something as well." Curious, Jack opened the package to find a book nestled beside the food, a well-worn copy of The Last of the Mohicans. "Thought you might enjoy it," Florence said, suddenly shy. "It was always one of my favorites." Jack ran his fingers over the leather cover, his expression softening. "Thank you. It's been a while since I had something new to read." As he mounted Copper, Jack looked down at Florence, seeming to wrestle with something he wanted to say. Finally, he simply tipped his hat. "I'll return the book when I'm finished." "Please do," Florence replied, meaning more than just the book. She watched until he disappeared from view, a curious emptiness settling in her chest once he was gone. The weeks that followed brought changes to the Harper homestead. Baby Sarah thrived, Margaret regained her strength, and the older children began to treat Florence as part of the family rather than a visitor. Florence established a small schoolroom in a corner of the kitchen, teaching the children reading and arithmetic between household chores. Jack visited more frequently than before, always with a practical reason, bringing game, helping with repairs, returning borrowed tools. Each visit lasted a little longer than the one before, and Florence found herself looking forward to their conversations, which ranged from books they had both read to their divergent experiences of the war. On one such visit in late June, Jack arrived with a packet of letters for Florence. "Stagecoach brought them to Clearwater," he explained. "Station master remembered your name when I asked." The letters were from Florence's father and stepmother, full of concern about her silence and news from Boston. Florence realized with a pang that in the chaos of her arrival and subsequent events, she had never written to let them know she was safe. "I've been terrible," she confessed to Jack as they sat on the porch that evening, the children already in bed and Thomas and Margaret enjoying a rare moment alone inside. They must have been so worried. "You'll write them tomorrow," Jack said practically. "Explain what happened." Florence sighed. "What should I tell them? That I was nearly—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Tell them you found good people," Jack suggested. "Tell them you're making a life here." Florence looked at him curiously. "Am I? Making a life here?" Jack's gaze was steady. "Aren't you?" The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken implications. Florence had come to Montana expecting to stay only long enough to earn passage back east. But now— "I think I am," she admitted softly. "I didn't expect to feel at home here." Jack nodded, something like satisfaction in his expression. "Montana grows on you." "It's not just Montana," Florence said, gathering her courage. "It's the people." Jack's eyes met hers, and this time there was no mistaking the warmth in them. "Florence," he began, his voice rough with emotion. The moment was shattered by a piercing scream from inside the house. Jack was on his feet instantly, hand on his pistol. Florence rushed after him into the house to find Margaret doubled over in pain, blood soaking through her skirt. "The baby," Thomas said, his face ashen. "Something's wrong with the baby." The next hours were a blur of activity. Florence sent Jack to fetch the midwife from a neighboring homestead while she and Thomas helped Margaret to bed. By the time Jack returned with Mrs. Whitaker, an elderly woman known for her skill with difficult births, Margaret was delirious with fever. "Childbed fever," Mrs. Whitaker pronounced grimly. "And she's bleeding inside. We need to get that fever down or we'll lose her." Through the night, they worked in shifts to cool Margaret's burning skin with damp cloths, while Mrs. Whitaker prepared herbal remedies. Jack took charge of the children, his quiet strength a stabilizing presence in the household. Near dawn, Margaret's fever finally broke. Mrs. Whitaker, exhausted but relieved, declared the worst was over. "She'll be weak for some time," she warned. "No heavy work for at least a month. And there won't be more children, I'm afraid." The bleeding was too severe. Thomas nodded, grief and relief mingling in his expression as he sat beside his sleeping wife. "As long as she lives, that's all that matters." Florence, drained from the night's ordeal, stepped outside to watch the sunrise. Jack joined her, offering a cup of coffee. "You were remarkable in there," he said quietly. Florence shook her head. "Mrs. Whitaker saved her. I just followed instructions." "You kept the family together," Jack insisted. "The children trust you. Thomas relies on you." "They've been kind to me," Florence replied. "I owe them so much." Jack was silent for a moment, watching the golden light spread across the landscape. "What will you do now?" he finally asked, with Margaret needing so much care. Florence understood the question beneath his words. With Margaret's recovery expected to take months rather than weeks, Florence's temporary position had become something more permanent. "I'll stay as long as they need me," she said simply. "Where else would I go?" Jack's expression was unreadable as he stared into his coffee cup. "You could go home, back to Boston. Your family misses you." Florence studied his profile, wondering at the tension in his jaw. "Are you trying to be rid of me, Mr. Blackwood?" Jack looked up sharply. "No. God, no." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Florence had come to recognize as a sign of inner turmoil. "Just giving you the choice. Before you get too settled." "Too settled for what?" Jack hesitated, then spoke with careful precision. "For considering other options." Florence's heart quickened. "What other options might I be considering?" Jack set down his coffee cup and turned to face her fully. In the early morning light, his eyes were the color of the Montana sky. "Florence," he said, her name almost a caress. "I'm not good with words, not like in your books. But these past months, seeing you here, watching you build a life despite everything, it's meant something to me." Florence held her breath, afraid to hope for what his words might be leading to. "I have a cabin," Jack continued. "It's small, lonely, but it could be something more, with the right person." Florence's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Jack, are you asking—" "Florence Reed," Thomas's voice called from inside the house. "Margaret's asking for you." The moment shattered, Jack stepped back, his expression closing off. "Go," he said. "She needs you." Torn, Florence hesitated only briefly before hurrying inside to Margaret's bedside. By the time she emerged again, Jack was gone, only a note left with Thomas explaining he had cattle to tend and would return in a few days. Those few days stretched into 2 weeks with no sign of Jack. Florence threw herself into caring for Margaret and the children, trying not to watch the road for a familiar rider on a buckskin horse. Had she misunderstood his intentions? Or had he regretted his near declaration in the cold light of day? Then, one evening, as Florence sat on the porch mending clothes, the sound of hoofbeats made her look up. Jack was approaching, but not alone. Beside him rode a woman Florence had never seen before, middle-aged, well-dressed, with a bearing that spoke of Eastern refinement. Florence's heart sank. Had Jack brought a sweetheart? A wife he'd never mentioned? She forced herself to smile as they dismounted, though the effort made her face ache. "Florence," Jack greeted her, his expression impossible to read. "This is Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, my mother." Relief and confusion washed over Florence in equal measure. "Your mother? From Virginia?" The elegant woman stepped forward, studying Florence with keen interest. "So you're the Boston girl my son has written about?" she said, her southern accent pronounced but genteel. "I can see why he was so insistent I meet you." Florence glanced at Jack in surprise. He had written to his mother about her? Jack cleared his throat. "Ma arrived in Clearwater yesterday. Surprise visit." There was a hint of defensiveness in his tone, as if expecting Florence to question why he hadn't mentioned his mother might be coming. Mrs. Blackwood smiled warmly. "After 8 years of Jack telling me not to make the journey, I decided to see this Montana territory for myself, and to meet the young woman who is featured so prominently in my son's recent letters." Florence felt her cheeks warm. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Blackwood. Please, come inside. I'm sure the Harpers would love to meet you as well." The evening that followed was one of the most remarkable of Florence's time in Montana. Mrs. Blackwood charmed the Harper children with stories of Virginia plantations and slipped easily into conversation with Margaret about Eastern social customs they both missed. Even Thomas seemed impressed by her knowledge of agriculture and her practical questions about Montana ranching. Throughout it all, Florence watched Jack. He seemed both proud of his mother and slightly embarrassed by her forthright manner, especially when she began to share stories of his childhood. "Jack was always the serious one," she told Florence as they sat together after dinner. "Even as a boy, carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. His father, God rest his soul, was the same way." "When did you lose Mr. Blackwood?" Florence asked gently. A shadow crossed Mrs. Blackwood's face. "At Gettysburg. Jack was there too, though in a different regiment. He found out after the battle that his father had fallen." Florence glanced at Jack, who was staring into the fire, his expression distant. She had known he fought for the Confederacy, but they had never discussed the specifics. "I'm so sorry," she said to Mrs. Blackwood. "For both of you." The older woman patted her hand. "Life goes on, my dear. We rebuild. Jack has done that here, I can see. Created something from nothing." Her gaze was knowing. though a home needs more than just land and livestock to truly be complete. Later, as the Harpers prepared for bed, Jack suggested he and Florence walk Mrs. Blackwood out to see the night sky. The three stood in the yard, looking up at the vast expanse of stars. "I never imagined such a sky," Mrs. Blackwood murmured. "In Virginia, we thought our stars were magnificent. But this? It's one of the things I've come to love about Montana," Florence said. "The sky seems endless." Mrs. Blackwood glanced between Florence and her son. "I think I'll turn in early. Tomorrow will be a long day if we're to see Jack's ranch." After she had gone back inside, Florence and Jack stood in awkward silence, both acutely aware of their last conversation and its abrupt end. "Your mother is wonderful," Florence finally said. "I can see where you get your strength." Jack nodded. "She's adapted better than I expected. Always thought she was too attached to Virginia society to appreciate Montana." "People can surprise you," Florence suggested, "when given the chance." Jack turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Florence, about what I was trying to say before I left." Florence held her breath, afraid to hope yet unable to stop herself. "I'm not good at this," Jack admitted. "Never courted properly, even before the war. But these past months, getting to know you." He took a deep breath. "I find myself thinking about you. All the time, when I'm working cattle, when I'm reading at night. Wondering what you'd say about things I see, or if something would make you smile." Florence's heart was racing now. "I think about you too," she whispered. Jack took a step closer. "I don't have much to offer. My land is small, the cabin basic. Winters are hard out here. But I promise you this, I'd work every day to make you happy. To build something worthy of you." "Jack," Florence said, her voice trembling with emotion, "are you asking me to marry you?" Jack reached for her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "Yes, if you'll have me. If you can see a future here. With me." Florence looked up at this man who had saved her life, and then, slowly but surely, captured her heart. The quiet cowboy who had said nothing at first but whose actions had spoken volumes. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you. Jack Blackwood." The joy that transformed Jack's face made him look younger, erasing the lines that hardship and solitude had etched there. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he drew her into his arms. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a promise rather than a passion. But as Florence wound her arms around Jack's neck, the kiss deepened, years of loneliness dissolving in the warmth of newfound love. When they finally parted, both breathless, Jack rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since I found you behind that store," he confessed. Florence smiled. "Even bruised and frightened as I was?" "Especially then," Jack said. "You looked at me like I might be your salvation. No one had ever looked at me that way before." "You were my salvation," Florence said softly. "And now, perhaps, I can be yours." From the porch came the sound of a throat being cleared. They turned to find Mrs. Blackwood standing there, a pleased smile on her face. "I see congratulations are in order," she said. "Though I suspected as much when Jack insisted I make this journey." Jack shook his head, but he was smiling. "Can't keep anything from you, Ma." "Nor should you try," she replied tartly. "Now, shall we tell the Harpers our news, or wait until morning?" The news was received with joy by the Harper family. Margaret, though still weak, insisted on helping plan the wedding. Thomas clapped Jack on the shoulder and declared it, "About time you found someone to warm that empty cabin." The wedding took place 2 months later, on a golden September day. The ceremony was held on Jack's land, no longer just a ranch, but now truly a home. Neighbors from miles around attended, curious to see the Boston bookshop girl who had captured the heart of the solitary rancher. Florence wore a simple white dress that Margaret and Mrs. Blackwood had worked on together, with wildflowers in her hair. Jack, looking almost uncomfortable in a new shirt and clean trousers, couldn't take his eyes off her as they spoke their vows beneath the big Montana sky. I, Jackson Blackwood, take you, Florence Reed, to be my lawfully wedded wife, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. Florence, looking up at this man who had become her world, repeated the vows with a heart full of certainty. This was not the life she had imagined for herself when she left Boston, but it was the life she now knew she was meant to have. After the ceremony, there was feasting and dancing, music provided by a fiddler from Clearwater. Florence was introduced to neighbors she had never met, all curious about Jack's bride, and all seemingly pleased to see the change in him. "Never seen Blackwood smile so much," one old-timer commented. "You've worked a miracle, madam." As the celebration continued, Florence found a quiet moment with Mrs. Blackwood, who would be returning to Virginia the following week. "Are you sure you won't stay longer?" Florence asked. "We have room." Mrs. Blackwood patted her hand. "Virginia is still home, my dear. But I'll visit again. Perhaps next time there will be a grandchild to meet." Florence blushed. "We haven't discussed children yet." "You don't need to discuss them for them to arrive," Mrs. Blackwood said with a wink, "and Jack was always good with his little sister. He'll make a fine father." As the sun began to set, the guests gradually departed, leaving the newlyweds alone on their land. Jack led Florence to where Copper was waiting, decorated with ribbons for the occasion. "I have something to show you," he said, helping her mount. They rode a short distance from the cabin, cresting a small hill that overlooked the property. In the valley below, Florence could see the cabin, the barn, the corral, and beyond them, the pastures where Jack's small herd grazed. But what caught her eye was a new structure near the cabin, the frame of a building taking shape. "What is that?" she asked. Jack's arms tightened around her waist. "Been working on it whenever I could get away. It's going to be a proper house. 2 stories, with glass windows and a real kitchen. Even a room just for books." Florence turned in the saddle to look at him, tears filling her eyes. "You've been building us a home." Jack nodded, a hint of uncertainty in his expression. "Is it what you want? To stay here? Make a life with me?" Florence reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "Jack Blackwood, I've never wanted anything more in my life." As the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, Jack lowered his head to kiss his wife. No longer the bruised and frightened woman he had found behind the store, but the strong, loving partner who had brought light back into his life. "Welcome home, Florence Blackwood," he whispered against her lips. "Welcome home." 1 year later, Florence stood on the porch of their new house, watching Jack return from checking the herd. The 2-story home he had promised was complete, with a room full of books as he had said, and another room prepared for the child she carried due to arrive in just 2 months. As Jack dismounted and walked toward her, Florence marveled at how much her life had changed since that terrifying evening in Clearwater. The bruised and shaking woman behind the store was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and deeply loved. Jack reached the porch and pulled her into his arms, his hand resting protectively over her rounded belly. "How are my girls today?" he asked, his voice tender in a way few people ever heard. Florence smiled up at her husband. "We're perfect, especially now that you're home." Jack kissed her gently, then more deeply, still in awe of the miracle that had brought this remarkable woman into his life. "I'm always coming home to you," he promised. Always. And as the Montana sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Florence knew that what had begun as the darkest moment of her life had led her to the brightest future she could have imagined, in the arms of the quiet cowboy who had said nothing at first, but whose love now spoke volumes every day.